It is a widely held opinion that planting trees will contribute significantly to saving the planet from climate change. Few people question that. Of course, basic biology tells us that trees absorb, capture and sequester carbon from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, CO2, during photosynthesis. So far, that is true, but this discussion is about the practical application of the biology. CO2 is a so-called greenhouse gas that threatens the Earth with the many detrimental consequences of rising average temperatures on the global scale. The greatly increased concentration of atmospheric CO2 is now well known, massive quantities of data dispelling any reasonable doubt. Apart from a few deniers, some of whom are more influential than their ignorance should permit, it is universally acknowledged that elevated CO2 is a major cause of global climate change, also known as global warming. It is generally held that if we plant millions, indeed billions of trees, they will soak up that excess atmospheric CO2, allowing global temperatures to stabilise and maybe return to normality. The more I consider the tree planting remedy, the more strongly I conclude that it's been built on pretty shaky foundations. Its appeal as a mitigation measure lies in that it is relatively easy to apply, and it has grabbed the attention of the public, who love the idea and volunteer to participate. My question is, will tree planting achieve what is presumed of it? The answer that nags my mind is, at best, it's pretty unlikely. In fact, probably no. Of course, now that tree planting is so deeply embedded in public awareness and aspirations, I wish I wasn't rowing against this tide of popular opinion. So will somebody please settle my anxiety in this matter and tell me I'm wrong, and if so, why? I can take it. I take courage from a passage written in 1929 by Bertrand Russell. The fact that an opinion has been widely held is no evidence whatever that it is not utterly absurd. Indeed, a widespread belief is more likely to be foolish than sensible. Was he right? See the Wikipedia list of common misconceptions. Am I right? Let's find out. As a method, tree planting is easily understood by the general public, who can be persuaded to volunteer in droves to do the donkey work, playing their part in saving the planet. However, the project seems to be driven by a raft of over-optimistic assumptions, which, if examined critically, become progressively unconvincing. As I see it, tree planting is probably not, as tree planting proponents would have us believe, the environmental panacea in which so many people have confidence. In most circles, my question has probably never been considered, or at best, considered and rejected. Anyway, the notion is preposterous, isn't it? Now that the voting population knows tree planting will save the planet, politicians have become confident that public tree planting will help get them out of a tricky responsibility, climate change. It doesn't matter whether it's going to be effective or doomed to failure, it's good for votes. At the 2019 UK general election, every major party's manifesto contained a promise of tree planting, claiming that trees will be the solution for climate change. They competed over it. Here are those pledges in ascending order of extravagance. Conservatives, 30 million. SNP, 30 million. Lib Dems, 60 million. Greens, 70 million. And Labour are whacking 100 million trees every year until, who knows when. So, back to my question. Am I right to be sceptical about claims being made for the climate change benefits of tree planting? I will explain my case by presenting two main arguments. Please note that reservations I may hold with regard to other aspects of the post-millennial obsession with tree planting belong to other discussions, several of them which I'll tackle elsewhere. But I'm not entirely alone with my views. Argument 1, and this is crucial. If the planted trees grow at all, how well do they grow? It is usually assumed that all you need do is stick the trees in and leave them to it. Maybe provide them with a protective tube and do a bit of weeding until they can fend for themselves. If you look at tree planting schemes, you can see that they sometimes, maybe often, grow patchily or poorly, and some of them barely at all. People seem to be unquestioningly satisfied that trees planted will just turn into British woodland. Job done. This tightly packed etiolated monoculture of birches, or are they poplars, certainly grew successfully, but is hardly worthy of the label woodland. It's a plantation, a crop, maybe a windbreak. Here's another artificial planting. Like the birches we just saw, these trees also constitute a uniform plantation of spindly logs, lacking the diversity and heterogeneity characteristic of natural woodland. Not a single species monoculture this time, and these close-planted, mixed broadleaf trees have also grown well, but they're not ready to be called woodland, a definable, complex ecological community that will probably take many decades to evolve, even though the trees themselves seem to be doing well. However, some tree planting schemes, perhaps many, has anybody counted, are decidedly unsuccessful. Here the land is disturbed, waterlogged, stony and acidic, lacks organic matter, is probably nutrient deficient, and is desperately unsuitable for trees. Of course it failed. At this site, woodland trees, including oak for goodness sake, were planted in wet, acidic moorland peat. It may be suitable for heather, asphodel, deergrass and sphagnum, but woodland? No wonder if, when you peer down the tubes, few contain a living tree and the few survivors, 10 years after planting, have barely grown at all. They're bonsai. How could anybody expect this pathetic little oak to thrive with its roots dunked in a bog? Oak trees not only need a well-balanced, properly drained, mineral-based soil, but they're entirely dependent upon ectomycorrhizal fungi, absent in this type of soil, or they will die. For more about mycorrhiza, visit www.slef.org.uk. Anyhow, after almost 20 years of struggling, by 2016 these trees were dead. They never stood a chance, but did the planter consider that? Of course, this project failed too, commemorated by an abandoned array of empty tubes. The banks of a new bypass in 2015. Did the planters not understand that trees need more than a thin layer of stony, reclaimed mud if they are to grow properly? Amazingly, after a few seasons, some of them seem to be doing better than might have been expected, possibly because, for a short while, disturbed soil will release its otherwise locked-up nutrients. Will the saplings continue to grow with so little to support them, or, after an initial burst, fizzle out? I predict the latter. Does anybody notice when only a few of the trees they planted actually grow? I hope there are official statistics that record trees planted and trees that survive. Surely the funders and land managers need to know, at a minimum, those basic statistics. This is supposedly, air quotes, restoration of land exhausted by 2 crops of conifers by simply bunging in a few hazels. Restoration? Woodland creation? Dead trees, moribund trees, unsuitable trees, and a vigorous invasion by non-native Sitka spruce seeded from adjacent plantations. This so-called woodland creation scheme will become woodland only if left to nature for a very, very long time. Once funding has been granted, project viability becomes irrelevant. On this hillside, a woodland creation scheme failed pretty well entirely, apart from a few birches and struggling, hardly grown at all, less resilient other species. Meanwhile, small natural woodland already present, growing on soils suitable to support woodland, was thriving and expanding vigorously. Signs on access gates proudly announced, "A new woodland is being created for your enjoyment." The stripes in the snow are the lines of planting humps, thousands of them, but very, very few trees. Never mind. 22 years later, in 2019, The same landowner applied for and received a second tranche of funding to replant on the same soils where experience had already shown trees are reluctant to thrive. I think we might predict a limited outcome, composed in decidedly clumsy grammar that exposes the land agent's poor grasp of ecology. New signs proudly inform the public, this woodland has been funded to increase the level of productive and native woodland to create a biodiverse habitat throughout Scotland. That's both intelligence insulting and untrue. One of the plantings, as announced to increase native woodland and biodiversity, is a monoculture of sycamore trees. Just a crop, very different from Scottish woodland. Would it be cynical to speculate, particularly knowing the fate of the previous mass planting, that the real intention of the project might be, Next, my second discussion point, argument 2. After will the trees grow, I ask the main part of my question. Will millions of planted trees be effective in capturing enough carbon to mitigate climate change in time to save the planet? To which my answer, unless persuasively contradicted again, has to be no. Come on, show me I'm wrong, and I'll happily change my mind and withdraw from this uncomfortable controversy. Here's the reasoning that compels me to swim against the tide of received wisdom. How and why has the gas carbon dioxide, aka CO2, become a climate problem? CO2 is released from the hydrocarbon fuels we extract from below ground and burn, coal, oil, gas, etc. That has been going on for over 150 years, ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations have risen alarmingly over that period and might be expected to have a consequence. That's the greenhouse effect, which has caused worldwide temperatures to rise above average levels. The presumption is that since trees absorb CO2 and incorporate it in their tissues, that lots of them planted will reduce atmospheric levels, hopefully back to normal. That's the misconception I'm challenging, that trees will soak up at least a significant fraction of the excess unwanted CO2. The CO2 will be captured, but not very much of it and not permanently. It will simply be recycled in various ways, finding its way back into the atmosphere before climate change is stopped or reversed. The two major sources of CO2 releasing hydrocarbons are coal and oil, both created over 250 million years ago and stored naturally below ground where they have remained until very recently. Some figures. In 2014, humans released 36 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. An average person generates 1,000 tons of CO2 per 100 years, while in 100 years a tree will absorb only 1 ton of CO2. So how many trees are needed to absorb those billions of tons of excess CO2, and how long will that take? Remember, we have to wait for them to grow to maturity before we can expect them to begin the work we demand of them. Do you now see why I question the sense of tree planting in order to combat climate change? It gets more complicated. Tree planting schemes like this will take several decades to reach anything approaching maturity, while the need to reduce atmospheric CO2 levels is really, really urgent. We can't wait for them to grow, and when eventually they do, their CO2 sequestering ability will be woefully inadequate. The Forestry Commission will be heavily involved. What do they say? Here's what their CEO blogged. One thing pretty much everyone will agree on is that we need to plant more trees. Now that we are committed in law to net zero emissions by 2050, the imperative for tree planting has only got more urgent. However, it's not even that straightforward. Ian Gamble's again. Planting trees can only make a limited contribution to net zero emissions by 2050. The new trees, as Ian Gamble's himself has estimated, occupying land equivalent in area to Norfolk and Suffolk combined, would absorb perhaps 10% of residual emissions if all other reduction measures are implemented. There is only so much tree planting we can do across the UK, so it's crucial that emissions are cut across the whole economy. Trees only 10%. I think that answers my question. Alternative measures are required, other than trees, whose contribution to mitigating climate change will be, at the very best, only 10%. And there are further Forestry Commission complications. On BBC Radio 4's Farming Today, Charlotte Smith interviewed Mark Broadmeadow, the Forestry Commission's principal climate change advisor. She asked whether landowners will try to plant woodland in Grade 4 land. Now, DEFRA defines Grade 4 land as land with severe limitations which significantly restrict the range of crops and/or level of yields. It is mainly suited to grass with occasional arable crops, e.g. cereals and forage crops, the yields of which are variable, meaning that Grade 4 land is not very suitable for growing plants, let alone trees, about which another DEFRA recommendation says trees should be planted only in Grade 1 land. Broadmeadow's reply bodes ill for emergency carbon capture. Landowners will continue to put in smaller areas of woodland on the poorer performing, of course that is Grade 4, land. The interviewer had clearly asked about Grade 4 land, which according to DEFRA advice will barely support plants, let alone trees or woodland. As far as public funding and climate change are concerned, that's money for rotten old rope. During the same interview, Charlotte Smith again. Mark Broadmeadow from the Forestry Commission says planting trees may become a more attractive option under the new public money for public goods system, where you might get paid over a longer period for things like carbon sequestration and public access. Funding for carbon sequestration, that is CO2 capture and its storage by trees as carbohydrate, by planting trees on land that's unsuitable for growing trees. The illogic continues. Broadmeadow's response was at once revealing and deeply disturbing. You get a planting grant to establish a woodland, a maintenance grant that covers the management you're going to have to put in for 10 years to get the trees established, and then no income stream for a number of years, possibly 20 years, until the trees are 30 or 40 years old, when you will start to get some income from them. So landowners funded to plant trees to sequester carbon from the atmosphere are expected to chop them down just as they are reaching an age at which they might begin to sequester meaningful quantities of carbon. To the landowner, it's all about income, financially incentivized to pretend to participate in an environment protection project. So there you have it, all about income. Income for a landowner from public initiatives intended to combat climate change. Is landowner income public money for the public good? Income for a landowner from harvesting publicly funded timber when, at only 30 to 40 years old, it has barely begun sequestering atmospheric carbon to combat climate change for the public good? Is income the reason landowners and politicians are so keen to create woodland? How exactly, may I ask, does early harvesting of trees planted at public expense, ostensibly to capture carbon, the maximum possible 10% of that needed for any hope of saving the planet, contribute to climate change mitigation? And who benefits? The people, the planet, or landowning individuals anxious to profit from otherwise unprofitable Grade 4 land? So please let's be honest with ourselves about tree planting. Landowners and investors funded to plant trees are likely to consider themselves also owners of a cash crop they may exploit, from which they will be enabled to earn a subsidy to plant unproductive land with trees that probably won't grow very well. They will also expect an income from their tree crop as soon as it reaches harvestable stature, aged just 30 to 40 years. Consequently, much of those crop trees' carbon content will be returned to the atmosphere, recycled. And in this instance, recycling is not beneficial to us. Next, professional foresters consider traditional tree harvesting and timber extraction techniques to be impractical and uneconomical. The monster Tonka toy machines they use in modern forest clearance dismantle biodiversity and destroy soil structure, environmental damage which actually generates additional carbon emissions. Then, even if trees are left to mature and die naturally, average life 150 years, many much older, much of the carbon sequestered in their tissues will be returned to the atmosphere after, geologically speaking, a trivial passage of time. The lifetime of crop trees is trifling compared with the millions of years it took back in the Carboniferous period for immense volumes of vegetable carbohydrate to be stabilized and stored below ground before humans, burning coal, also oil, gas, etc., transferred it to the atmosphere in gaseous form, where it will remain an insignificant fraction of it recycling via immature trees until we invent a properly effective mechanism for retrieving and storing it. So, the problems with tree planting for carbon sequestration are variable tree establishment from total to almost none. Assuming they actually grow, trees planted now will eventually capture atmospheric CO2 only up to 10% of that required to achieve the UK target of net zero emissions by 2050. While we watch the Great Barrier Reef die, tundra and forest burn, glaciers shrink and low countries flood, maybe we should be concentrating on capturing the remaining 90+%. Under natural circumstances, if achieved at all, that 10% contribution to net zero will be rapidly recycled, atmosphere to trees, to atmosphere to trees, to atmosphere, etc. But artificial plantations are not natural. By 2050, established trees will be harvested just as they are approaching maturity, having sequestered precious little carbon during their 30-40 years spent growing up. 2050 marks the beginning of that 30 to 40 years after planting, when landowners will want to realise their income stream. If we in the UK must plant trees occupying land equivalent in area to Norfolk and Suffolk combined, in order to achieve at its maximum 10% of our net zero carbon target by 2050, and assuming that all of those trees survive so as to be able to grow to maturity, spoiler, many won't, and considering that those sapling trees will not be able to contribute significantly to that target until they've done some growing, maybe 30 to 40 years from planting, and assuming the trees remain where they are planted, i.e. not die, so that they may continue and increase harvesting and storing excess atmospheric carbon, while bearing in mind that tropical rainforest is being destroyed at a rate equivalent to the area of the UK every year now, and as it has been for many years past, and also bearing in mind that here in the UK, the 4.5 square kilometres of conifer plantation in Scotland, an area remarkably similar to that of Norfolk and Suffolk combined, is currently being clear-felled. Bearing all that in mind, will planting a few trees in the UK, consider that on a worldwide scale millions is just a few, will planting a few trees on our tiny islands really provide a meaningful contribution to the climate crisis that threatens the entire planet? Conclusion. Tree planting is unlikely to make a significant contribution to saving us from the consequences of climate change. I have kind but persuasive critics who insist that if I raise objections, as I have done in this presentation, I should provide, or at least suggest, solutions. I usually try to comply, but in this case I reckon it might be too difficult, some might say arrogant, for me to attempt something way beyond my capabilities, which is really up to world leaders, specialist scientists and technologists, and industries. However, maybe I might propose a couple of aspirations. A, that carbon emissions might actually be reduced with the ridiculous excuse of carbon offset trading abolished. And B, not tree planting, but wilding of land where trees will rapidly grow naturally if left to do it in the ways that evolved long before humans interfered with ecological processes. Next, please watch the Economist and NEP, that's spelled KNEP, videos linked below. Around the globe, good people are doing their utmost to create and introduce urgently needed measures that will mitigate climate change. But their efforts are impeded by a few previously alluded to influential nation leaders who, in their ignorance or self-centered personal interests, deny climate change, exempting their nations from the crucial global effort to return our atmosphere to the condition in which our species evolved. If they fail, so probably will our species, unless we take firm control of ourselves, and that pretty soon, because extinction is probably not that far away. Of course, of the leaders who have let us down, the President of the United States these past 4 disheartening years stands out as having pretty well single-handedly, deliberately obstructed the rest of the world's basic requirement and right, survival. Even if he didn't do it unassisted, the ultimate responsibility is his. The United States' previously inconceivable withdrawal from the Paris Accord of 2017 might turn out one day to have been a bit more than an error of judgment, rather little short of catastrophic, affecting the lives of very many innocent people.
My solemn duty to protect America and its citizens. The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord Thank you. Thank you.
He'll listen to the scientists. If I listened totally to the scientists, we would right now have a country that would be in a massive depression.
Oh, come on.
Okay. It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
Hey, well, I don't think science knows, actually.
You what?
When state officials there blame the fires on climate change, Mr. President, you said, I don't think the science knows. Over your 4 years, you have pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord. You have rolled back a number of Obama environmental records. What do you believe about the science of climate change, and what will you do in the next 4 years to confront it?
I want crystal clean water and air. I want beautiful, clean air. We have now the lowest carbon. If you look at our numbers right now, we are doing phenomenally. If you look at the Paris Accord, it was a disaster from our standpoint. And people are actually very happy about what's going on because our businesses are doing well.
Today, I'm pleased to announce the United States will join 1 Trillion Trees Initiative, being launched here at the World Economic Forum. 1 trillion trees.
Really?
And I'm an environmentalist. A lot of people don't understand that. And I think I know more about the environment than most people.
What the? Oh dear. But perhaps at the end of the tunnel a chink of light can be seen. After several years of our despairing that we will ever right the sinking ship that is our only home, that chink is at last expanding. Just a few days to go before the US 2020 presidential election, there is a distinct probability of leadership change and reversal of the current US administration's idiotic demolition of obviously beneficial regulations it used in various ways to protect the environment we all inhabit.
Yes, Mr. President. I'll listen to the scientists, and I'll empower them.
Perhaps, as we move into 2021, greed, ignorance, and sheer asininity in high places will have been replaced with leadership more in sympathy with the lives of people, plus realistic solutions that hopefully will halt or even reverse climate change to the benefit of all planet Earth's inhabitants, its biodiversity. We aren't the only species affected by this crisis, you know. All are.